After watching the process of making artillery shell steel knives in Taiwan, I finally understand why Taiwan's cleavers are renowned worldwide. Just for a single knife, they choose to craft it from military shell casings. Its sharpness can effortlessly cut through hair and slice through bone like mud. Even a supercar on water is just a dot in front of it. Here in Nantou, Taiwan, China, there's a blacksmith shop known as the King of Cleavers. The King of Cleavers has their special forging treasure, artillery shell casings made of rare hard steel leftover from 1958, the first step in crafting a shell knife. The worker first has to clean the cut surface of the shell to remove any uneven textures created during cutting to prevent cracking later. Then, they start the cutting machine, position the shell at the center point, and split it in half. One piece can be forged into 2 kitchen knives with a whole shell split into 4 pieces. This means a single artillery shell can produce at least 8 knives. At that time, over 400,000 shells were fired, which gives you an idea of how huge that number is. In the blink of an eye, the handle was also hammered out by the worker. Although this step looks a bit rough at the time, However, his craft is quite meticulous. You should know that the shell casing is made from medium carbon alloy steel, which is exceptionally hard and tough. Compared to knives made from ordinary metal, this blade can rival them without the need for the traditional technique of welding steel. At this stage, the blade has undergone a noticeable transformation. After striking the handle hundreds or thousands of times, the blade has reached an unprecedented thickness, followed by the master's consistent refinement. Judging by the surroundings, this small workshop must have decades of history. Besides crafting kitchen knives, they can also make some farming tools like hoes and axes. For decades, the old man has endured noise and heat day in and day out, year after year. Yet this hasn't affected his love for the craft. Next, continue to observe to check if the blade meets the standards. Then, take a piece of cardboard, draw the model of the finished cleaver on it, and use a cutting tool to trim off the excess edges. A mold is thus formed. Once the mold is completed, the master places the cleaver under the cutting machine to trim the excess edges. Now it looks more like a knife, doesn't it? Moving forward, they start measuring the dimensions, first checking if the knife blade reaches a certain width. Next, they take out the previously made model and place it on top to check if the cleaver is consistent. If there is any deviation in size, mark it and cut it off. Once the blade processing is completed. Now moving on to the next step, grinding. You see the worker holding the blade and grinding the spine. Precision isn't necessary for the spine, so they just apply force while grinding. Meanwhile, the other side is also being processed at this time. Now, let's take a look at the general shape of the blade compared to the finished product. The dimensions are consistent, and it seems the master is quite satisfied with this chef's knife. Next, we move on to the step of grinding the blade edge. First, the grinding machine is used to thin the edge at an even speed, so all areas are uniformly thinned. This is considered rough grinding. This is the initial edge sharpening process for the cleaver. Now the second edge sharpening begins, which involves coarser grinding compared to the first.
With entirely manual operation.
Every time the blade is pushed forward, a piece of metal shaving falls off. The elderly craftsman needs to push it hundreds of times from thick to thin. That's how the edge is made so sharp. You might ask, if both sides are iron, why is the top harder? Now the third stage of edge sharpening begins. The elder uses a fine file to scrape along the edge continuously, with each stroke shedding a bit of residue. Compared to the previous stages, this process is more impressive. As the edge takes shape, we move on to quenching. It seems they don't heat the entire blade red hot. Only the blade edge is heated until red and then quenched in oil. This is quite different from the Parker wood technique. Quenching metal mainly reduces brittleness. To enhance the blade's structure for optimal toughness, then place the handle into the furnace to heat it. Next, take out another crucial component, the knife handle. Since the iron piece at the top isn't very secure, it requires some light finishing. Then, while it's still hot, insert the blade into it. It's a bit puzzling how the old master handles the blade without getting burned. Luckily, the installation process seemed to go smoothly. In a moment, the handle was attached to the blade. Next, it was time for the artisan's favorite technique. How could a handcrafted iron knife be without a mark? The famous kitchen knife king was just stamped by the master. Now, let's start the fourth sharpening. No wonder this knife is sharp. Since it can be polished to a mirror-like shine, let's check its weight. It weighs over 3 pounds. Net weight just over 3 pounds. Does it feel heavy to you? Now let's test its sharpness. Tuna is effortlessly sliced like tofu in front of the knife. How much do you think this artillery shell knife is worth?